Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by High Tech Answers and Healthcare Now Radio, part of the Answers Media Network, and is sponsored by the law offices of Myrick O'Connell. Now here is your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Dustin Hutchison, President of Pondurance. Welcome, Dustin.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on today. And before we get into the main part of our conversation, would you like to give everyone a little bit of an introduction in terms of who you are and what you do?
Yeah. I'm the President and COO of Pondurance. Pondurance is a cybersecurity services firm based in Indianapolis with a secondary site in Tampa. We perform threat hunting and response services, and then also a long list of advisory and technical testing, like application security and penetration testing. We're also a PCI QSA assessor, and then also a high trust certifying company also.
So have you always been involved in the healthcare field, or what first brought you into it?
Well, yeah. So when I started my career, I was actually a sophomore in college. I was majoring in cognitive science. And one of my minor was computer science. And I said, you know what, this is what I actually like. And so my mom is a nurse practitioner, and she said, hey, over the summer, you can come intern at my company. And so it was a healthcare company, occupational health. And I ended up doing some low-level database administration tasks. And I said, you know what, I like this realm. And so I shifted my major into computer information technology. And then almost immediately got a job at a small hospital in Indiana. So I finished out my bachelor's degree, stayed at that hospital. I was doing a lot of great stuff from PC support and server support, network support, dabbled in biomed devices, and then even phone systems. And HIPAA was really ramping up at the time. And so I had one of my strong mentors say, you know what? Look at security, and that may be the route to go. And so I dug into it, went and got my Security Plus certification, and I realized, you know what, I want to keep doing this, but I don't necessarily want to be the guy fixing, doing the break fix. So I got my MBA, and I said, you know what, I need to be able to speak the vocabulary of the C-levels, and I left healthcare for a little bit. 2-3 years, went to the energy industry, and then said, you know what, I miss it too much. I miss that closeness of healthcare. I miss that small village of a hospital, and decided to come back. It was in a different role. Same health organization based in Indiana, but I was focused on risk and compliance. And so finished up my MBA, and I said, you know what, I'm going to keep doing the education side too. Went and got a PhD. My dissertation focused on the adoption of cloud computing in healthcare, and stayed with that job for about 5 years. And then one of my close friends, Lana Lewis, my now business partner at Pondurance, called me and said, "Hey, we need help over here. Got a lot of healthcare clients that need regulatory compliance help." And I said, "That sounds great." And so joined Pondurance, and we've continued to grow the business. And we've got about 65% of our business now is healthcare. And it's been exciting to see how we can take, the problems that healthcare has, translate those to other organizations and industries, but then also the inverse. So taking the best practices outside of healthcare and bringing them in. And so it's been nice, again, like I said, with my mother being a nurse practitioner, I was always around that, healthcare vocabulary. I had that, a few years exposure to it, and realized that I really enjoyed the environment.
So kind of picking up what you just said in terms of, I guess a few pieces of it, where you said that you left the healthcare industry for a couple of years, and I think you said we're in energy, but then also with your current role in company, you're servicing both healthcare and outside of healthcare. So does it help to kind of, or I guess, how does that help you identify issues that are impacting the healthcare industry that maybe have been addressed in other industries, or vice versa? Because I think you did say that there is a kind of a nice flow back and forth from that perspective.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because healthcare has normally been behind the curve from an adoption standpoint of technology, when it's not specifically focused on patient care. And that includes security. And so being able to see, these companies like technology that's more at the forefront of adoption, and then being able to say, all right, what makes sense from a healthcare standpoint? What's digestible to help you along that maturity path to get better, has been really nice. One of the unfortunate things with healthcare is the influx in incidents and breaches. And so over the past 2 or 3 years, they've definitely kind of shifted that paradigm from the slow adopter to being more proactive from the security standpoint, for sure, though.
And kind of picking up on what you just said about the breaches, certainly I'm sure we're both reading the same things in terms of healthcare being targeted. Maybe I don't know if there's any data to help provide any backup on this, but do you think it really is that healthcare is suffering more attacks, or is it just because, at least in the U.S., because of HIPAA and the requirement to disclose breaches that doesn't necessarily exist in a lot of the other industries in the U.S., that healthcare just gets the most notice because of that forced disclosure?
Yeah, and you're right. Because of that regulatory compliance and the HHS wall of shame and the requirement, there may be more of a push to actually, be public about that. But, like the Verizon data breach report is a great resource. Healthcare from the social attack standpoint was number 2. And so with or without the requirement to actually report, I think healthcare is a target because of the vast exposure. And so, you think back 10, 15 years ago where a hospital was pretty well contained within the walls of the hospital. There's been such a huge influx of, cloud providers, third-party vendors, and even third-party service vendors like radiology companies or any of these patient care-focused entities that are no longer employed by the hospitals. So that attack vector, the entire attack surface, has really expanded also.
No, I think that is a very fair point. And actually kind of thinking about that, the expanded potential for attack vectors, even though you didn't just mention it, one of the bigger pieces that seems to be coming up in conversations nowadays are wearables or connected Internet of Things devices. So kind of what are you seeing in that realm?
Yeah, so it's also interesting the influx that we're seeing, not only from the consumer side, but also from the organization side. So Pondurance, we do a lot of vendor risk assessments for our clients. And so the whole point there is the due diligence before the ink is signed on the contract. What is the vendor introducing into your environment that poses a potential risk? And so we're trying to get more and more of our clients to think about that from, where's the data going, inputs and outputs, where's it stored? And so IoT and wearables have really, we've seen a spike up in the past year or two with vendors proposing these types of solutions. And so, in the wearables from the consumer standpoint, it's the stuff that we're familiar with, Fitbits and the Apple Watch and the Garmin. They've got embedded sensors. They collect information from the wearer, the surroundings. They may connect to a user's cell phone. They may not. We've also seen Google Glass, the Snapchat spectacles, and even virtual reality and augmented reality headsets are shifting into that same realm. And they really are. They are a subset of IoT or Internet of Things, which is really just anything that's connected. NIST says it's got to have a unique identifier and some sort of communication mechanism. So things like home thermostats, Amazon Alexa devices, Google Home, smart TVs, goes on and on. But the idea is that they've got some sort of data collection, they've got some sort of sensor, and they've got some sort of ability to communicate. And so when you think about that from the healthcare standpoint, that could be really powerful offering.
Yeah, no, certainly. It's, kind of from that standpoint, it's, as you said, there's a lot of data or information that could be brought in. So can you provide any kind of concrete examples in terms of how wearables are being brought into it? Because I think you mentioned that you're seeing a lot of vendors suggesting their usage.
Yeah, so the big names, Philips, GE, they've got these patient monitoring or these biosensor devices that monitor vitals. Body posture, step count, they can detect falls. That makes a lot of sense, and it's contained within the walls of the hospital. It's not the normal device that we see next to the bedside, and that's what I'm seeing more and more of, where entities are looking at this saying, "Hey, that makes a lot of sense. It's more comfortable. It seems less intrusive. It's just strapped on." You've got the traditional wireless IV pumps are widely recognized as one of those that people think about from an attack vector standpoint. Also pacemakers, and then any of the insulin pumps too.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It's I think with a bunch of the examples you just gave sound like they're actually more of maybe not traditional type medical devices, but certainly medical devices that are targeted and pretty much usable within the primary healthcare system as opposed to consumer-directed products.
Yeah, there is a shift though. So, Apple's their health kit and some of the other vendors that have opened that up. Vendors or startups and even health organizations are looking at it and saying, you know what, that's nice because a lot of consumers already own this device, or we can buy the Apple Watch for the patient, and things like reducing readmits. So after a patient had some surgery, for example, or some sort of procedure, saying, all right, we're going to track and see what your heart rate is over X number of days, make sure you get the right number of steps, and then you share that data with us. That's kind of the lowest common denominator right now from the device standpoint that I'm seeing, where because caregivers care about that information, and it's not just that point in time of the actual office visit or hospital stay. So from a cost standpoint, if they don't have to have eyes on patient within those walls, and they can still get the data that they care about, that's important.
So if you're talking about data coming from some of the more, I guess, less industry developed devices or industry focused devices, is there any concern about the quality or the accuracy of the data that would be coming from, say like an Apple Watch or a Garmin tool?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that does scare me. I've personally tested 3 devices at once to see if I would get similar results, and they were a little bit skewed. And so if you think about the threshold that a caregiver cares about, can you operate within that range to make a decision? And so understanding what the baseline is really key. And that maybe doesn't matter as much when the stakes aren't so high with things like number of steps or how many hours did you sleep. What we're seeing right now from a sensor or recording standpoint, but I worry about what happens down the road when there's more interaction or more data collected, and those thresholds need to be very, very tight, and that's when more of the concerns from a security standpoint really matter.
Right, and it would also seem as those devices become more integrated or increasingly used in tracking or delivering care, at what point does it become a medical device that would become subject to oversight by the FDA?
Right, and that's a great point. It's that data and how it's used and who's it useful for. So me with my Apple Watch, I love the fact that I can track a workout and I can see how many hours I slept and what my resting heart rate is. But if there's care decisions based on that, if I wanted to put my watch on my 5-year-old and have him run around, get his heart rate tracked and his number of steps tracked, to pretend make my insurance go down or not get readmitted to the hospital, the ability to skew that data is something that everybody needs to be concerned about.
Yeah, and actually that example you gave is I'm not sure even one that I would necessarily be thinking about, because it's you have to, as you said, you have to worry about not just how accurate the data that's being collected is, or that the data that can be generated through the device, but also where that data is coming from in terms of whether or not the individual is gaming the system. Because I think you've probably heard reports when there's fitness or wellness challenges at companies of people figuring out ways to put a device onto a hamster wheel or something like that, so it artificially inflates or changes the outcomes.
Right. Yeah. I had a bet running with my brother-in-law who could get the most number of steps in a day, and I was very tempted to strap it onto my kid and let him run around the yard.
Yeah. as you said, one thing when you're doing something like that, another one that you've actually got treatment decisions being based upon it. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Dustin Hutchison from Pondurance, and we've been talking about wearables and other devices and expanding care. And I think as we've been talking about it so far, Dustin, you've kind of touched on security or privacy a couple of times. So I'd like to kind of shift the conversation over into that realm and as a way to set it up, do you want to lay out what you see as some of the primary privacy and security issues around these devices?
Yeah, so I think there's some misconceptions about how the data is being aggregated or not being aggregated. So I worry from the general consumer standpoint, where is this data actually being stored and how is it being used? So there's a story at the end of last year where U.S. soldiers were wearing fitness devices, and there were third-party mapping websites showing these routes that were being ran by a bunch of people. Well, it ultimately exposed where U.S. military bases were. And so things like that, where you don't think about who else can see the data or how the vendor is using it, and being able to share those routes and naming them, base perimeter or sniper alley. It's one of those things where you may not think about that because you think about you're the sole user of that device, but the data aggregation ends up being a really big deal. And then also not being able to manage these devices on a large scale. So it's one thing if you bought it for yourself and you're just using it, but you look at a healthcare organization that says, all right, we're going to buy all of these X type of patients, this type of device. How do you manage those? How do you track them? How do you monitor them? It's not the same as a workstation or a laptop to patch from a security standpoint. So there's gaps in the management, and that's what I worry about right now. Also, like we mentioned with data being used to make care decisions, can that data be intercepted and modified? And that's the same concern across the board from anything from an integrity standpoint. Usually from an information security or risk management perspective, we compartmentalize everything into confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so that integrity piece of the puzzle when making decisions about how to treat someone is a really big deal when you don't know where that device has been. And so that's something that I think people need to think about. Then also the protocols and transmission. So, is a vendor using a well-known industry accepted algorithm for, encryption at rest and in transit? That's the same question we ask our vendors now for our cloud-based systems or on-prem systems. But that also applies to these devices when you're extending that border, that boundary of what is touching the patient.
Yeah, no, I think that, as you said, it really seems, and it seems like part of that discussion would be driven by, who the targeted user is of the device. I think if you've got the device running through the caregiver, then to the patient, arguably, there you maybe have more of an expectation in terms of what privacy or security might come into play, since the device manufacturer could be bringing themselves directly into a regulatory scheme, as opposed to if it's more of a consumer device like an Apple Watch where anyone can go get it, but then it's chosen to connect that to your provider, there's less requirement for the types of assurances that you were describing.
Right. So it's where's that scope end? So from a HIPAA standpoint, if I've got one patient's data on one device and they lose that device because it's not really in my control, am I okay with that risk? And is it encrypted to a level that I'm even more okay with that risk? And so it's that whole risk profile of what we're introducing into the environments that really matters.
Yeah, no, that's and it seems like that's definitely going to be a key going forward. So, do you see any means to help either standardize or to get a better handle on those types of issues?
Yeah, and I think there's options from both sides of the fence, the consumer and the enterprise side. I think clear terms and conditions, so some guarantee the way the data is being used and it's clearly understood and doesn't change later necessarily. I think specific protocols from a security standpoint, some consistency is really going to be key. And then the ability to opt in and opt out if there are those additional third-party sharing applications. And some of that's up to the consumer too. If you're not looking at this sandbox version from an organization, from the consumer standpoint, if I share my fitness routine with my, diet app, with a, run share app, what are the downstream repercussions? It's almost like that business associate agreement model where you bring in the contractors. Where's this, the confidence in how the data is being used actually end, and who's reliable for it? And so, consumers can take all the right steps, from strong passwords, multi-factor authentication when possible, especially on the vendor website, using the biometric option, or at least a PIN on the device you're using, reviewing the software, what it's asking to access. Apple's doing a really good job of the granular controls on what type of access is sharing. But again, that confidence in that vendor that you're sharing it with, where does that end? And then those same things apply to the organization saying, all right, we're going to adopt this type of device. Think about that entire data flow. Where does the data go, and what are you doing at every step to protect it?
Right. And, I think from my perspective, if you've got the organization stepping in and entering the equation, there's probably a better likelihood of the organization being able to drive some type of change or control, because frankly, I draft these types of agreements for clients and also talk with individuals about it. And, for better or for worse, I think first off, no one actually reads the terms of use or understands how the information might be flowing. And then even if you do, it seems like the only option is to either have to agree to that or not use the device.
Right. And then so, we see that too with our clients where they say, you know what, our hands are tied. We're not going to get Apple, or we're not going to get GE to change what they're doing. And that's where there are options. And it's, that due diligence in the first place. Are you looking at it? And then also thinking about what can you do from, the administrative or the technical standpoint, and work with the vendor. And so a lot of times, there are these kind of mass movements when enough people, I don't want to say complain, and I don't want to say don't adopt the software, but try to work with these vendors and help them understand what the requirement looks like in their world. So having more of that partnership look at this, I think, is going to be key in the future.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that like you, that will actually develop, because I think a lot of these manufacturers will hopefully recognize, there are some baseline expectations, and I think, given all of the headlines that have been generated by the, I'll say, alleged misuse of information, because, from a technical standpoint, I don't know if any of it was misused, if, even if the use was buried within a document that people hadn't necessarily been paying attention to. But I think, just the increased desire to protect privacy, coupled with changes in the law in other parts of the world, that might just drive, self-motivated change.
Yeah, you're right. And that's the thing. GDPR is a good example. It made people take another look at what they're giving up and what they're actually collecting from the organization standpoint. And then some of the other privacy pushes we've seen in the U.S., I think we've got more momentum now than we've ever had before that actually will impact the individual. And so that's good. We're not there yet. And so in the meantime, those stopgaps of understanding, where's that data landing? Can it be re-identified? Is it being shared with, vendors or third parties that you trust and are actually protecting it? Because the thing is, once it's out there, it's out there. You can't get it back. And that's the scary thing about these pieces of data. And so it's getting in front of it is key.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, as you said, is, like the old saying goes, once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't let it back in. And I think that is a major issue that, whether you're talking healthcare or anything, any other industry, that is the issue that's being grappled with right now.
Right. So, PCI, for example, my credit card gets breached, I get a new credit card. From the personally identifiable information standpoint, you only get one social security number. And so that's one of the things where that valuable piece of data, I don't even want to guess how many times it's been exposed to people that wouldn't have a business necessary need to look at it. And so, we've got an issue. And so getting in front of it to figure out how to reduce that likelihood down the road is going to be key.
Yes, it's and I don't know if an easy one, and maybe this is an unfair question, but do you think there is a likelihood of a change in the law in the United States to try and address some of these issues, or would it be better to allow the private industry to work through a solution by itself?
So I like what HIPAA does, for example, from a framework standpoint, but it's gray. It's not black and white. It's not do these things and you're going to be fine. And it's never really the goal of compliance anyway. I don't feel like it's you need to go down this path and then fix and find the appropriate security solutions. And on the inverse is PCI, where that's not the government saying thou shalt do this, but this is the internal bodies. Both are very effective. It's one of those where I don't feel like it's necessarily the gold standard on either side of the fence, but it's better than nothing. And so I think an easier method from a protocol standpoint and a security standpoint makes a lot of sense, where it's harder for people to pick things that are less secure. And so, I mentioned NIST earlier. They've published a new guidance document that focused on what's between the consumer and cloud computing. And I'm not kidding. They called it fog computing, and there's this subset called mist computing. But the idea is that there are millions of these IoT devices, including these wearables, and then you've got to have some layer between that. So when you think about how that data moves, is there a solution from a protocol standpoint that it just makes sense to use this? I don't know what this is yet, but it's if you design it from a secure fashion in the first place and it's easy to adopt, there's an easy on-ramp, that is going to help. And so I'm hopeful for something like that.
Yeah, no, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what comes to pass because, as you said, there is some good materials that are coming out. But believe it or not, we are already at a time. So, Dustin, I want to thank you for a great conversation today.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.